Okay, this is part 2 of the fill-in-the-blank presentation. You'll need to know this information for the test, right? The war in Europe and the Pacific, right? This is the Axis powers or Hitler's partners, except for Japan, which was in the Pacific Ocean, and Finland, which was in Northern Europe. The other countries that were Germany's part of the Axis powers were very central to Germany, very close to Germany. Italy, Croatia, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania. That was the Axis powers. Now, in the Allied powers, as you see, were all over the world. Of course, it started, here in Europe and Poland, the Soviet Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was the USSR, or mostly Russia during this time. Australia had a very big role, as much as they could do. China, United Kingdom, or Great Britain, where Churchill was the prime minister. France, the United States, Canada, Brazil, South Africa. Unfortunately, most of the countries, except for the United States and Canada and the United Kingdom, there wasn't a lot that they could do to help. They were busy defending their own borders, but there wasn't a lot that they could do to contribute to the war effort in general. Right? The war in Europe and the Atlantic. The U.S. felt that Germany was the greater threat, even though we had been invaded by Japan and that Germany was invading Russia. We felt that the European theater was the greater threat. So FDR, which is Franklin Roosevelt, and George Marshall, who was the organizer of victory, focused on the war in Europe. Stalin wanted the Allies to open a second front in Western Europe after the Battle of Stalingrad, but the British felt that the United States was not prepared. Hitler was invading Russia, and Stalin wanted us to come and help him defend his borders, but the other allies felt that there was just no way that the United States had enough manpower to go to both fronts. That's George Marshall. He was the organizer of victory. He was the man who was in charge of kind of organizing the whole, where the troops went. Right. During this presentation, you will assume the role of a military analyst who is asked to use maps and background information to recommend a strategy for the U.S. to use to defeat the Axis powers. So as we go through this presentation, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to think about it. Because this is all online, you don't have to do this in a notebook, but I do want you to think about what your decisions would be, and it will help you understand the decisions that the leaders made. Okay, when the United States entered World War II, the Axis forces were superior in both numbers and strength. So the enemy had more military power, more soldiers, and better weapons. So choose your strategy carefully. Okay. Decision 1, February 1942. The United States recently entered the war on the side of the Allies. Unfortunately, the United States has limited military divisions ready for immediate deployment to Europe. Which military strategy would you advise President Roosevelt to pursue? So we're in the war, but we have very limited resources that we can send to Europe. So what is your advice going to be to your military? Strategy 1. Do you want to deploy divisions to Britain, launch an immediate cross-channel invasion of France, and then move eastward to liberate Paris? Okay, so this would be strategy 1. Or do you want to deploy divisions to the Mediterranean and launch an invasion of Italy from naval ships, capture the island of Sicily first, and then advance north onto the mainland? Strategy 3, defend the Soviet Union, move Allied divisions into the western part of the Soviet Union, and help the Red Army defend itself against German divisions. Or strategy 4, launch an invasion of North Africa from Egypt and from naval ships in the Atlantic, advance toward Tunisia and defeat German divisions. Okay, so in other words, do you want to go here, or where do you think we would be most effective in helping the Allies? Well, General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of U.S. forces in Europe, agreed with General Marshall that the focus should be on Western Europe. So instead, the U.S. and Britain landed in North Africa in 1942, successfully defeating the Germans. However, this left Russia to defend itself against German advances. Excuse me. So Russia would hold hard feelings against Great Britain and the United States because they lost many men and suffered the most during the war on the Allies' side. So if you chose strategy 1, you were correct. All right. Allied forces then successfully moved into Sicily and Italy in 1943 under the command of General George Patton. All right, and Italy surrenders. And if you see this here, this is actually the body of Mussolini and his wife. And that was not Allied forces that attacked Mussolini and his wife. That were his own people because he had been so cruel. They actually captured them. They murdered both him and his wife, and they hung their bodies from the balcony where he used to give his speeches. He was arrested. Benito Mussolini was overthrown, arrested, and hanged by his own people. All right, the Atlantic Wall. Along the shoreline of the Eastern Channel, the Nazis built fortifications to make a landing in France as difficult as possible. Right, and this is the kind of fortifications that they had. You can imagine coming in on a ship and trying to land the little landing boats and then facing tanks like this. Here's another picture of this is to keep to provide a barricade so that the Allied soldiers could not land. All right, the war in Europe and Atlantic. The Allies finally opened a second front in Europe with the invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day, on June 6, 1944. General Omar Bradley commanded the invasion. Allied troops advanced rapidly through France and retook Paris. Germany surprised the Allies with a fierce counterattack at the Battle of the Bulge in 1944. You see here the Battle of the Bulge. It was just freezing cold, and it was a horrible battle. Many students get these times mixed up, but D-Day was in the summer, in June, and the Allies landed there on the beaches of Normandy. The Battle of the Bulge was in the winter, and it was a horrible battle. When Germany was a surprise attack. Okay. African American units are the first used in combat at the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, and remember, at this time they still had segregated forces. This was the first time that African Americans were allowed to fight. The Tuskegee Airmen were black pilots who served as bomber escorts. So they proved themselves amazingly well, and they escorted bomber planes all over Europe. And they were so good at their job that the white pilots requested that they be escorted by the Tuskegee Airmen. The U.S. military had just acquired detailed information. This is your second decision. The U.S. military has just acquired detailed information about the location of concentration camps in Europe. Which military strategy do you advise President Roosevelt to pursue? Number 1, divert some American planes to bomb concentration camps. In addition, bomb all railroads leading to the camps. Strategy 2, refrain from bombing concentration camps, maintain current precision bombing raids, and reevaluate the decision in 6 months. Okay, and there's going to be some links that I'm going to post. I want you to watch those links if you are a remote student and you don't have an opportunity to watch them in class with us. But you do need to see those. It will help you understand more about the concentration camps. All right. After the German attack collapsed, Western Allies and Soviets invade Germany in 1945. Hitler committed suicide and Germany surrendered in May 1945. Right? And here's a map, a military map. All right, now the leaders in World War II. The Supreme Allied Commander over all Allied forces in Europe. He planned for D-Day. This is Dwight Eisenhower. Just a little fun fact, his nickname was Ike. His campaign, he actually ran for president later. His campaign song was I Like Ike. I actually have a dog who kind of looks like Ike, and so that's what we named him, Ike. There's a little Easter egg for you. General George Marshall served as the Chief of Staff of the U.S. military during World War II, and he was the Chief Military Advisor to President Franklin Roosevelt. Omar Bradley, he was the commander of the U.S. Army in Europe. He led American forces at Normandy and in the Battle of the Bulge. And General George S. Patton, he was the general who led the United States Army to victories in Italy and North Africa. All right, the war in the Asia and the Pacific. The U.S. also fought Japan in the Pacific in this multi-front war. After Pearl Harbor, Japan took several Pacific islands, including the Philippines. All right, the U.S. and Filipino prisoners of war were forced on the Bataan Death March in 1942. This was a horrible experience, and the prisoners of war in Japan, or the Japanese prisoners of war, actually had many times a much worse experience than those who were taken prisoner in Europe, and they were forced on this. I believe it was a 60-mile march. Most of them did not survive. I'm going to post a list of movies that I would suggest that you see. One of them is about this Bataan Death March. I'll have those on the website. All right, here's your third decision. The Japanese control most of the Pacific. The Allies are using the majority of their resources to fight the war in Europe. Given the current situation, which military strategy did you advise President Roosevelt to pursue? 1. Create a staging area in inland China. Launch an air assault on the nearby Japanese mainland. 2. Liberate Japanese-occupied islands in the Pacific. Create a staging area on each liberated island and prepare for the next advance. So 1, send your troops to China and invade there. Or 2, take these little islands one at a time, and as you take them and liberate them, then move closer. Number 3, build air bases in the Aleutian Islands. Launch bombing raids directly on the Japanese mainland by using the new B-29 bombers. Or strategy 4, contain the Japanese and stop their expansion in the Pacific. Wait until the war is won in Europe and then increase Allied forces in the Pacific. Well, the tide in the Pacific turned in 1943 when the U.S. Navy, commanded by Admiral Chester Nimitz, defeated the Japanese fleet at the Battle of Midway. This was the major turning point in the war. Okay? And if you were trying to keep up with the decision actually went with strategy 2. They liberated the islands. This was called the strategy of island hopping. And as they would liberate one island, they would move closer and closer in. All right. Under General Douglas MacArthur, U.S. troops gradually retook the Pacific using the strategy known as island hopping, eventually reaching close to Japan's homeland. Okay, the Navajo Code Talkers. These were Navajo Native Americans. The Navajo language was a code it had never been put in writing. I'm sorry. I'm trying to read this as I talk, and I apologize for all my verbal mistakes today. But the Navajo Code Talkers were Native Americans. The Navajo language had never been put in written form, and so the Japanese were decoding all of our messages until they brought in some Navajo soldiers, and they were able to code messages, and the Japanese were never able to decode them to understand what messages they were sending back and forth. All right. Despite Allied victory in Europe, the war in the Pacific continues. Although some predict that Japan is close to surrendering, others warn that if the Japanese do not surrender, an invasion of Japan will take many months and may result in the deaths of thousands of Allied forces. So now President Roosevelt has just died, and now Truman is president. Okay? Truman has just told you that the United States has at its disposal several atomic bombs. Okay, given the information that if the war continues and Japan continues to fight, we're going to lose many more soldiers, and it's going to take more months. So, but now you know that we have atomic bombs. What strategy do you advise President Truman to pursue? Number 1, drop an atomic bomb on a large Japanese city. Continue to drop bombs on other cities until Japan surrenders. Number 2, plan a large-scale invasion of Japan. Prepare staging areas on nearby islands and attack Japan by air and sea. Number 3, wait as long as needed for Japan to surrender. Continue the naval blockade and massive bombing raids. Well, Franklin Roosevelt had created the Manhattan Project to build an atomic bomb. And it was so secret that even his vice president didn't know about it. But Roosevelt died in the beginning of his 4th term as president. The new president, Harry Truman, decides to use the new atomic bomb against Japan in order to avoid massive casualties in a land invasion. So if you went with strategy number 1, you were right along with what Truman decided to do. Okay. U.S. bombs the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1947. Okay, and I'll have a link to that website there for you to take a look at that. Japan finally surrendered and World War II comes to an end. All right, here's U.S. leaders in the Pacific. General Douglas MacArthur was commander of the U.S. Army in the Pacific Theater. He oversaw Japan's surrender on September 1st, 1945. And Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Naval Fleet in the Pacific Theater during World War II. He is actually from Fredericksburg, Texas. There's an amazing World War II museum there in Fredericksburg. I believe it's still called the Nimitz Museum, and it has, it's really, you could easily spend 2 days touring it, and it's all about the World War II and the Pacific. It's a very, very interesting museum. If you have an opportunity to go to Fredericksburg when the pandemic is over, I would suggest that you do that. It's very interesting. All right, the legacy of World War II. All right, over 70 million people were killed worldwide. The majority of the people were civilians. And I want you to look very closely at this chart. Okay, the Soviet Union, okay, the red is military deaths. The civilian deaths are in orange, and the red and orange is the total, and the blue is the percentage of the 1939 population. So look at the Soviet Union. They lost 24 million people in the war. China lost what is that? It looks like about 18 or 20 million. So although the United States, I believe we lost about, I'm sorry, I can't remember exactly. It seems like 500,000. But look at that compared to the other countries. Basically because we were saved by the distance of the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans protecting us, protecting our borders. Over 100 million military personnel fight, making it the largest war in history. There were 400,000 United States soldiers killed in battle. Germany and Japan are occupied by Allied troops, and their leaders are tried for war crimes. This is what happens after the war. The Nuremberg trials. Individuals are responsible for their actions even in war. And I would highly suggest that you see a movie called The Judgment at Nuremberg. It's an old movie. I believe it was 1964. If you can find it, it's an excellent movie about the trials that took place for the war criminals in Germany. Germany is divided into 4 occupational zones, and this is very important. This is going to lead to our next unit because the Soviet Union is, remember, they're communist, and we don't really like the communists much better than we liked the Nazis, but we had to unite with them to defeat Hitler in the war. So Germany is divided up, and the Soviet Union gets a large part, and this is going to cause problems later. Berlin, which is the capital of Germany, is right in the middle of the Soviet occupation, but Berlin, that little city, is divided among all 4 Allied countries, the control of it, even though it is in the middle of the Russian occupation, which is going to cause a big problem later. In addition to the atomic bomb, technology played a large role in the Allied victory. Because of the war technology that we needed, sonar was developed, radar, cryptic code breaking, antibiotics, all of which have lasting effects and are used today. U.S. troops liberate concentration camps and find the survivors of Hitler's attempt to exterminate the Jews and others during the Holocaust. I strongly suggest that you see some movies about this. One movie, it's very hard to watch, but it is probably one of the best I've ever seen about the Holocaust. Is called Schindler's List. Another one is called Life is Beautiful. I would highly recommend both of those movies. All right, the results of the Holocaust. Over 6 million Jews are killed. Some countries lose as much as 90% of the Jewish population. See, Poland there were 3,300,000 Jews before the war. After the war, there were only 3 million. After the war, 90% were killed. 3 million were killed during the war. Entire generations of Jews were exterminated. 6 million gypsies, political prisoners, elderly, and disabled are also executed by the Nazis. And I will put the link to that video there. I will put that on the page. Right? Vernon Baker was awarded the Medal of Honor 52 years after the war because of his heroic actions in Europe. He was, I believe, the first African American to be awarded the Medal of Honor, and it took them 52 years to give it to them. The war ends with the rise of 2 superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. All right? Now we're going to do an acrostic poem, and I'm going to post these instructions on a separate page. But you're going to you can work with an individual or a partner, and but you need to submit your own presentation. You will use World War II to create an acrostic poem and explain and describe World War II. So you're going to write World War II vertically. So you're going to write like WORLD, WAR, like that, and create a poem using each letter. In your poem, you need to include a description or an explanation of the following information on the next page. Choose any 9 pieces of information to complete your poem. So of these terms, you need to choose 9 and make sure that they are in your acrostic poem. And I will post an example of an acrostic poem as well. Okay, that concludes our notes for this unit.